Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place because that is all we do every week. Today's story is one that genuinely defies every law of physics and logic we hold dear. It is a tale that has sat in the files of local law enforcement for decades, unexplained and chilling to the bone. But before we get into that, if you could please gently remind the like button that it left its headlights on in the driveway and then offer to walk it out there in the rain only to lock the door behind it, that would be great. The Unseen Neighbor, the year was 1984. The setting was a remote stretch of the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina, a place where the trees grow so thick that even at high noon, the forest floor remains draped in a perpetual velvet twilight. It is the kind of place where the silence is heavy, almost physical, and when the wind catches the hemlocks, it sounds like 1,000 people whispering just out of earshot. Our protagonist is a man named Arthur Penhaligon. At the time of this story, Arthur was 54 years old. He was a man of routine, a retired structural engineer who had spent his life dealing with the hard, unyielding facts of math, weight, and physics. He was the kind of man who kept his tools organized by size and his ledger books balanced to the penny. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. He did not believe in ghosts, he did not believe in urban legends, and he certainly did not believe in the impossible. Arthur lived alone in a cabin he had built with his own 2 hands over the course of 5 years. It was situated nearly 10 miles from the nearest paved road, tucked into a fold of the mountainside that the locals referred to as the Deepening. For Arthur, the silence of the mountains was a sanctuary. He had a dog, a large, aging German shepherd named Buster, and a rotary telephone that rarely rang. He enjoyed the isolation. He enjoyed the fact that his only neighbors were the deer and the occasional black bear. On the night of November 14th, 1984, the weather took a turn for the worse. A massive cold front slammed into the mountains, bringing with it a torrential downpour and winds that howled through the gaps in the logs of Arthur's cabin. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in less than an hour, and the rain turned into a slushy, freezing mix that coated the trees in a layer of treacherous ice. At approximately 10:15 that evening, Arthur was sitting by his fireplace reading a technical manual about bridge stress points. Buster was curled at his feet, snoring softly. Suddenly, Buster stood up, his hackles raised, and let out a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the very bottom of his chest. Arthur looked up. He did not hear anything over the roar of the wind at first, but then he felt it. It was that prickling sensation on the back of the neck, the feeling of being watched by someone or something hidden in the shadows. He got up, grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, and walked to the window. The rain was lashing against the glass so hard he could barely see past the porch. But then, during a momentary lull in the wind, he heard it. Help. It was faint. It sounded distant, muffled by the woods, but it was unmistakably a human voice. It was a man's voice, strained and filled with an agonizing sense of urgency. Please, someone, help me. Arthur did not hesitate. He was a man of the mountains, and he knew that if someone was out there in this weather, they were in mortal danger. He put on his heavy yellow rain slicker, grabbed his shotgun, not out of malice, but out of caution, and stepped out into the storm. Buster followed closely at his side, though the dog seemed uncharacteristically hesitant to leave the porch. The search in the Raven Arthur spent the next 45 minutes trekking through the mud and the briars. The ice-covered branches snapped under his weight, and the wind tried its best to knock him off his feet. He called out repeatedly, "I am here, keep shouting, I am coming for you." Every few minutes the voice would respond. "Over here, I am trapped, please hurry." Arthur followed the sound. It led him deeper into a ravine that he knew well, a place called Devil's Elbow. It was a treacherous area with steep drops and loose shale. As he got closer, the voice grew louder, but it also started to sound strangely familiar. It had a cadence that Arthur recognized, a specific way of drawing out the vowels that felt like a memory he could not quite grasp. Finally, Arthur reached the bottom of the ravine. He swung his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the sheets of rain. He saw nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no person. "I am here," Arthur yelled. "Where are you?" The response came from directly in front of him, no more than 5 feet away. "I am right here. Please, my legs are broken." Arthur pointed his flashlight at the spot where the voice originated. There was nothing but a large, flat boulder and a patch of ferns. He walked to the boulder and looked behind it. Nothing. He checked the crevices in the rock. Nothing. He stood there for 10 minutes, drenched to the bone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. It was not the fear of an animal or an intruder. It was the fear of the wrongness of the situation. The voice had sounded like it was right in front of him, yet there was nobody there. It was as if the person speaking was invisible, or perhaps existing in a space just slightly to the left of reality. Cold and frustrated, Arthur made the long trek back to his cabin. He arrived home just after 11:30. He stripped off his wet clothes, dried off Buster, who was still trembling, and went straight to the kitchen to make a pot of coffee to stop his shivering. That is when the phone rang. The impossible caller. Now, you have to understand, in 1984, in rural North Carolina, getting a phone call at nearly midnight was usually a sign of a dire emergency. Arthur picked up the heavy black receiver of the rotary phone on his kitchen wall. "Hello," he said, his voice raspy from the cold. There was static on the line. A heavy, rhythmic clicking sound like an old-fashioned telegraph. Then a voice came through. "Help, please, someone help me." Arthur froze. It was the same voice from the woods. Exactly the same. "Who is this?" Arthur demanded, his grip tightening on the receiver. "Is this some kind of sick joke? I was just out there looking for you." "I was at the devil's elbow." The voice on the other end did not seem to hear him. It just kept repeating the plea. "I am at the bottom of the ravine. I cannot move my legs. Please call for help." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. "Listen to me," he shouted into the phone. "I was just at the ravine." "There is nobody there." "How are you calling me?" "Who are you?" The voice stopped its rhythmic crying. There was a long, agonizing pause, and then the person on the other end spoke in a tone that was no longer frantic, but eerily calm. "Arthur, is that you?" Arthur dropped the phone. It dangled by its coiled cord, hitting the wooden floor with a hollow thud. The voice on the other end was his own. It was not just a voice that sounded like him, it was his own voice, with his specific North Carolinian accent, his specific rasp from years of smoking, and his specific way of pronouncing his own name. He stared at the phone as it swung back and forth like a pendulum. From the speaker, he could still hear the faint, tiny sound of himself crying out for help. He lunged for the phone, picked it up, and screamed, "Who is this?" The line went dead. The second watch Arthur did not sleep that night. He sat in his chair with his shotgun across his lap, watching the door. The next morning, as soon as the sun broke over the ridge, he drove down to the sheriff's office in the valley. The sheriff at the time was a man named Miller, a veteran of 20 years who had seen just about everything from moonshiners to mountain lions. He listened to Arthur's story with a skeptical but respectful expression. Arthur was a pillar of the community, not a man known for drinking or delusions. "Arthur," Sheriff Miller said, leaning back in his chair, "you are telling me you heard a man in the woods, went to find him, found nobody, came home, and then that same man called you and he sounded like you?" "It did not just sound like me, Miller," Arthur said, his hands shaking. "It was me. I know my own voice. And here is the thing. I called the operator this morning. I asked them to trace the last call." The sheriff straightened up. "And? They told me the call came from inside my own house," Arthur whispered. The sheriff frowned. "That is impossible." "You were holding the only phone in the house." "I know," Arthur said. "But it gets worse. I went back to the ravine this morning before I came here. The rain had stopped and the sun was out. I found something." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tarnished object. He set it on the sheriff's desk. It was a silver pocket watch. The glass was cracked and the hands were frozen. The sheriff picked it up, an old watch. So? Look at the back, Arthur said. The sheriff flipped it over. Engraved in the silver were the initials A, P, and a date, June 12, 1955. This is my watch, Arthur said, his voice trembling. My father gave it to me when I graduated college. I have had it in my bedside drawer for 30 years. I checked that drawer this morning, Miller. My watch is still there. I am holding one, and the other one is in my house. But I found this one half buried in the mud at the bottom of the ravine where I heard the voice. The investigation at Devil's Elbow Sheriff Miller, now thoroughly disturbed, accompanied Arthur back to the cabin. They performed a full sweep of the property. They found nothing out of the ordinary save for the muddy footprints Arthur had left the night before. However, when they reached the ravine at Devil's Elbow, the sheriff's deputy, a younger man named Holloway, found something that made the hair on everyone's arms stand up. About 30 feet down the slope, wedged behind a large boulder, was a piece of clothing. It was a rain slicker, it was yellow, heavy-duty, and covered in grime. Arthur turned pale when he saw it. That looks like my coat. You said you were wearing yours last night, Arthur, the sheriff noted. I was. It is back at the cabin, hanging by the fire to dry. They bagged the coat and took it back. When they compared the two coats, they were identical. Same brand, same size, same wear patterns on the elbows, but the one from the ravine was different in one crucial way. It was incredibly old. The plastic was brittle, the yellow pigment had faded to a dull mustard color, and inside the collar, written in permanent marker, was the name Arthur Penhaligon. The writing was faded, but it was undeniably Arthur's handwriting. The sheriff decided to run a test. He went to the local telephone exchange, a small building where the operators knew everyone in town. He asked for the logs of the calls made to Arthur's residence on the night of November 14th. The operator, a woman named Martha, who had been there for 30 years, confirmed that a call had been placed to Arthur's number at 11:43 p.m. Where did it originate? Miller asked. Martha hesitated. Sheriff, this does not make any sense. The log says the call was placed from a Forest Service emergency phone located at the trailhead of Devil's Elbow. Okay, Miller said. So someone was out there at the trailhead. No, Sheriff, Martha replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. That Forest Service phone was disconnected in 1972. The lines were torn down during a storm 13 years ago. There is no physical way a signal could have traveled through those wires. They do not exist anymore. The body in the crevice. Over the next few weeks, Arthur Penhaligon became a ghost of his former self. He stopped reading, he stopped tending to his garden, he spent his hours staring at the two identical pocket watches and the two identical yellow coats. He felt like he was losing his grip on the very engineering principles that had defined his life. He began to develop a theory that defied everything he knew. He believed that somehow the him from the future, or perhaps a him from another timeline, had fallen into that ravine. He believed that the voice he heard in the woods was himself, dying or trapped, reaching out across a rift in time that should not exist. But if that was true, why was he still here? Why was he the one listening to the call and not the one making it? The local doctor suggested Arthur was suffering from a nervous breakdown brought on by isolation and the stress of the storm. But the sheriff could not explain the phone logs, he could not explain the second watch, and he certainly could not explain what happened on December 1st, 1984. On that afternoon, a group of hikers was exploring the area near Devil's Elbow. They were not looking for anything in particular, just enjoying the crisp mountain air. As they descended into the ravine, one of them spotted something strange. It was a skeleton. It was wedged deep into a crevice, partially covered by a rockfall that looked decades old. When the authorities arrived and excavated the site, they found a man's remains. Based on the bone structure and dental records, which would later be compared to Arthur's records from his time in the military, the body was a perfect match for Arthur Penhaligon. But there was one glaring problem. Arthur Penhaligon was still alive. He was standing on the rim of the ravine, watching the forensics team bag his own bones. The medical examiner determined that the man in the crevice had died from a fall. His legs had been crushed by the rocks, and he had likely survived for several hours, perhaps even a day, before succumbing to exposure. Beside the body, they found a rusted, primitive handheld radio, the kind used by forest rangers in the 1950s. It was turned to a frequency that had not been in use for a generation. And then they found the most terrifying piece of evidence of all. In the skeletal hand of the deceased man, they found a small handwritten note on a piece of weather-beaten paper. The ink was barely legible, but the words were clear. I called. I heard myself answer. He did not come for me. Why did he not come for me? The unfolding paradox. Arthur Penhaligon did not live much longer after that discovery. His health deteriorated rapidly. He became obsessed with the date of his own first death. He realized that the date on the watch, June 12th, 1955, was not the date the watch was made. It was the date he was supposed to have died. In 1955, when Arthur was 25 years old, he had been hiking in that very same area. He remembered a moment where he had slipped on the edge of the ravine, but he had caught himself on a sturdy root and climbed back up. At the time, he had laughed it off as a close call. He realized now that in some other version of reality, he had not caught that root. He had fallen. He had broken his legs. And in his dying moments, his desperation had been so great, his will to survive so powerful, that it had punched a hole through the fabric of time itself. The voice he heard in 1984 was the echo of his younger self from 1955, reaching forward 30 years to the only person who could possibly hear him, which was himself. The phone call he received in his cabin was his younger self, dying in the mud, somehow tapping into a telephone line that had not even been built yet, calling a number that he would not own for another 3 decades. But because the older Arthur had gone to the ravine and found nothing, he had inadvertently abandoned his younger self to die. The older Arthur had survived in 1955 by catching the root, but by doing so, he had created a paradox where his other self was trapped in the ravine forever, calling out into the void. The presence of the 2 watches and the 2 coats suggested that the 2 timelines had merged on that stormy night in 1984. The reality of the man who died and the reality of the man who lived had occupied the same space for a few brief hours. The final answer, Arthur Penhaligon passed away in his sleep in early 1985. The official cause of death was heart failure, but those who knew him said he simply gave up on living in a world that no longer followed the rules. After his death, Sheriff Miller went to the cabin to pack up Arthur's belongings. He found the 2 pocket watches sitting on the nightstand. He picked them up, intending to give them to Arthur's next of kin. As he held them, the sheriff noticed something that made him drop both watches on the floor. The watch that Arthur had owned his whole life, the one that was supposed to be new, began to tarnish right before the sheriff's eyes. The metal turned black, the glass cracked, and the hands began to spin wildly until they froze at the exact same position as the watch found in the ravine. At that exact moment, the telephone in the kitchen began to ring. Sheriff Miller walked into the kitchen. He stared at the black rotary phone. He knew he should not pick it up. He knew that whatever was on the other end was something that no human mind was meant to comprehend. But the ringing was insistent. It was loud. It felt like a physical weight in the room. The sheriff reached out and lifted the receiver. He did not hear a voice this time. He did not hear static. He heard the sound of a man catching his breath, the sound of a root snapping, and then the sound of someone, Arthur, screaming as he fell into a darkness that had no end. And then a voice, Arthur's voice, but old, tired, and sounding like it was coming from right behind the sheriff's shoulder, whispered into the line, "Do not worry, Miller," I finally answered. The sheriff hung up the phone, walked out of the cabin, and never looked back. He retired 3 months later and moved to the coast, as far away from the mountains as he could get. He never spoke of the incident again until he was on his own deathbed. To this day, hikers in the western North Carolina mountains occasionally report hearing a voice near Devil's Elbow. They say it sounds like a man calling for help, but the local rangers, those who have been there long enough to know the story, tell everyone the same thing. If you hear it, do not go looking for it. Because if you find him, you might just find the version of yourself that did not make it home. The story of Arthur Penhaligon remains one of the most baffling cold cases in the history of the Appalachian Trail. There are no rational explanations for the duplicated items, the impossible phone logs, or the body that appeared to be 30 years older than its own death date. It serves as a chilling reminder that time is not the straight line we think it is. Sometimes it loops, sometimes it breaks. And sometimes the person calling for help is the only person who will never come to save you. If you enjoyed this look into the impossible and the defying of all logic, please let us know. And remember, the next time your phone rings late at night and you are all alone, maybe just let it go to voicemail. Would you like me to research another case involving time slips or unexplained mountain disappearances for our next story? Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Because today, we are going to look at a case that truly defies every known law of physics and logic. It is a story that involves a high-security facility, a veteran security guard who thought he had seen everything, and a man who managed to be everywhere at once without ever actually being there. But before we get into that, if you could please gently offer the like button a cup of coffee, but then accidentally spill it on its favorite rug, that would be greatly appreciated. The Sentinel of the Night. To understand this story, you first have to meet a man named Arthur Vance. Now, in the year 2026, Arthur was 62 years old. He was a man of habit, a man of discipline, and a man who very much enjoyed the silence of the graveyard shift. He had spent 25 years working as a correction officer at a maximum security prison before retiring, but Arthur was not the type to sit on a porch and watch the grass grow. He needed a post. He needed a perimeter to walk. So he took a job as the head of night security for the Blackwood Corporate Center. This was not just any office building. It was a massive 6-story monolith of glass and steel located on the outskirts of a quiet town in Virginia. The building housed several high-end tech firms, a private wealth management group, and, most importantly, a massive subterranean server farm that held data for some of the most powerful people in the country. Because of what was stored there, the security protocols were intense. We are talking about biometric scanners, motion sensors that could detect a house cat at 50 yards, and a closed-circuit television system, CCTV, that consisted of 148 high-definition cameras. These cameras covered every square inch of the property. There were no blind spots, none. On the night of March 14th, 2026, Arthur arrived for his shift at exactly 10 o'clock in the evening. He followed his usual routine. He brewed a pot of black coffee, checked the logbook from the day shift, and sat down in front of the wall of monitors in the security hub. This hub was a windowless room in the center of the first floor, reinforced with steel plates. It was Arthur's kingdom. For the first 4 hours of his shift, everything was completely normal. He watched the cleaning crew finish their rounds and exit the building at 11:45. He saw the last of the software engineers leave at 12:15 in the morning. By 1 o'clock, Arthur was the only living soul inside the Blackwood Corporate Center. Or at least that is what the sensors told him. The man who was not there at exactly 2:22 in the morning, Arthur was taking a sip of his lukewarm coffee when his eyes drifted to monitor number 14. This camera was located in the third-floor executive lobby. It was a wide-angle lens that looked over a plush waiting area with leather chairs and a mahogany desk. Arthur froze. Standing in the center of the lobby was a man. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches. He was wearing a charcoal gray 3-piece suit that looked perfectly tailored. He had silver hair swept back neatly, and he was carrying a vintage leather briefcase. The man was not doing anything suspicious. He was just standing there. He was looking directly at the camera with a neutral expression. Arthur's first instinct was not fear, it was confusion. To get to the third floor, a person would have to pass through the front gates, walk through the main lobby, pass the security desk where Arthur was currently sitting, and then use a keycard to activate the elevator. Arthur looked at the monitors for the main entrance, nothing. He looked at the exterior perimeter cameras. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the pale blue light of the mercury vapor lamps. There were no cars. There were no footprints in the light dusting of snow that had fallen earlier that evening. Arthur reached for his radio and keyed the mic. Attention, this is Security Lead Vance. To the individual on the third floor, please remain where you are. You are trespassing in a restricted facility. The man on the screen did not move. He did not even blink. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. He decided to do a manual override of the camera system. He switched monitor number 14 to a live playback to see how the man had entered the room. He rewound the footage by 1 minute. 1 minute ago, the lobby was empty. He rewound it by 2 minutes. Still empty. Then he played it forward at normal speed. At exactly 2:22 and 11 seconds, the man simply appeared. There was no door opening, no flickering of the light. 1 frame, the room was empty. The next frame, he was standing there. Arthur stood up, his hand hovering over his holster. He was a veteran. He had dealt with riots and break-ins. He knew how to handle an intruder. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and headed for the elevator. As he rode the elevator up to the third floor, he kept his eyes on the small screen inside the elevator car, which allowed him to view the lobby he was heading toward. The man was still there. He was standing in the exact same spot, holding the briefcase. The elevator dinged, the doors slid open. Arthur stepped out, flashlight leveled, his voice booming. "Security! Hands where I can see them!" But as the beam of his flashlight cut across the third floor lobby, Arthur stopped dead. The lobby was empty. He panned the light from left to right. He checked behind the mahogany desk. He checked the executive restrooms. He checked the supply closet. There was nowhere to hide. The suite was a glass-walled enclosure. If someone had run down the hallway, Arthur would have seen them. If they had ducked into an office, he would have heard the door. He keyed his radio again, talking to the empty room. "Central, this is Vance. I am on 3. The intruder is gone. Check the feed." Then he realized he was Central. He was the only one there. He had to go back down to the security hub to see where the man had gone. The impossible multiplicity. When Arthur got back to the monitors, he felt a wave of nausea hit him. He did not just see the man on monitor 14 anymore. The man in the charcoal suit was now on monitor 22, which showed the basement boiler room. He was on monitor 48, which showed the 5th floor break room. He was on monitor 89, which showed the interior of the high security server vault. He was on monitor 112, which was a camera located inside the freight elevator. Arthur stared at the wall of screens. The man was in 12 different locations at once. And in every single shot, the man was doing the exact same thing. He was standing perfectly still, holding his briefcase, looking directly into the camera lens. Arthur's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He did something he had never done in his 30-year career. He picked up the phone and dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? A calm female voice asked. "This is Arthur Vance at the Blackwood Corporate Center," he said, his voice cracking. I have a multiple intruder situation. I need police backup immediately. I have a man on my security feed who is appearing in multiple restricted areas simultaneously. Sir, are you saying there are multiple men or one man in multiple places? The dispatcher asked. It is the same man, Arthur shouted. I do not know how he is doing it. He is not on the motion sensors. The alarms are not going off. But I am looking at him right now on 20 different screens. The dispatcher told him to stay on the line and that officers were 4 minutes away. While he waited, Arthur began to notice something even more disturbing. He looked closer at monitor 89, the server vault. This vault was a clean room. It required a specialized suit to enter to prevent dust from damaging the hardware. The man in the suit was standing inside the vault, but the air filtration sensors, which were sensitive enough to detect a single human hair, were reading as perfectly clean. Then, Arthur looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:36 in the morning. He looked back at the monitors. On every screen, the man began to move. But he did not walk. He did not turn around. He slowly began to raise his free hand, the one not holding the briefcase. He pointed. In every single camera view, the man was pointing at something off camera. Arthur tried to figure out what it was. On the third floor, he was pointing at a wall. In the basement, he was pointing at a pipe. In the server vault, he was pointing at a rack of hard drives. Arthur felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He began to realize that the man was not pointing at things in the rooms. If you followed the line of his finger across all the different camera angles, he was pointing toward the center of the building. He was pointing at the security hub. He was pointing at Arthur. The knock at the door. At 2:41 in the morning, 2 police officers arrived at the outer gate. Arthur remotely buzzed them in and watched them park their cruiser in the circular driveway. He watched them walk up to the front glass doors of the lobby. "I see them," Arthur told the dispatcher. "I am letting them in now." He hit the release for the front doors. The 2 officers, a young man and a slightly older woman, stepped into the main lobby. Arthur watched them on the monitor. "Officers, this is Vance in security. I am in the hub on floor 1. Can you hear me?" The officers looked up at the lobby camera and nodded. The older officer, whose name tag read Miller, spoke into her radio. "We hear you, Vance. Where is the intruder?" "That's the thing," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "Look behind you." On Arthur's monitor, the man in the charcoal suit was standing exactly 5 feet behind Officer Miller. He was standing right there in the open lobby, clear as day. Officer Miller and her partner spun around instantly, their hands on their sidearms. "There's no one here, Vance," Miller said into the radio. Arthur gasped. "He's right there! He's standing right in front of the directory sign. He's looking at you!" On the screen, the man was so close to Officer Miller that he could have reached out and touched her shoulder, but the officers were looking directly through him. Their flashlights swept through the space where the man stood, and the light did not reflect off his suit. It did not cast a shadow. It was as if the man was a ghost, visible only to the electronic eyes of the cameras. "Vance, are you seeing things?" the younger officer asked. "The lobby is clear." "I am not crazy," Arthur yelled. "Switch your radios to channel 4. I am going to patch the video feed to your mobile units." The officers did as they were told. A moment later, Officer Miller looked down at the digital screen on her handheld device, which showed the live feed of the lobby they were currently standing in. Arthur heard her catch her breath over the radio. "Oh my God," she whispered. On her own screen, she saw herself standing in the lobby. And she saw the man in the charcoal suit standing right behind her. She turned around again, physically looking at the empty air, then looked back at the screen. "Vance, what is this? Is this a prank? Is this some kind of augmented reality?" "I do not know," Arthur said. "But look at the other feeds." He patched the rest of the cameras to their units. The officers stood in the middle of the lobby, scrolling through the feeds of the entire building. They saw the man in the basement. They saw him in the break room. They saw him in the vault. "Wait," the younger officer said. "Look at camera 62. Camera 62 was the hallway directly outside the security hub where Arthur was sitting. Arthur looked at his own monitor for camera 62. The hallway was empty. "There's no one there," Arthur said. "Vance!" Miller's voice was urgent. "Look at the feed again." He just appeared. Arthur looked. Sure enough, on the monitor, the man in the suit was now standing right outside the heavy steel door of the security hub. Then something happened that made Arthur's heart nearly stop. The man on the screen reached out and knocked on the door. Arthur did not just see it on the screen, he heard it. Thump, thump, thump. 3 distinct heavy knocks on the reinforced steel door. Arthur backed away from the door, tripping over his rolling chair. "He's here! He's at the door!" "We're coming to you now!" Miller shouted. The 2 officers ran toward the security hub. Arthur watched them on the monitors as they sprinted down the hallway. On the screen, they ran right through the man in the charcoal suit. They did not even feel a breeze. They reached the door, weapons drawn. "Vance, open up!" Miller yelled. Arthur triggered the electronic lock. The officers burst into the room. They looked around the small hub. It was just Arthur, the wall of monitors, and the smell of stale coffee. "Where is he?" Miller asked. Arthur pointed at the screen for camera 62. The man was still standing in the hallway, looking at the closed door. "He's still out there," Arthur whispered. "But you just walked through him." The briefcase. For the next hour, the Blackwood Corporate Center was swarmed by more police, and eventually, the building's IT director and the facility manager were called in. They thought the system had been hacked. They thought someone was looping footage or inserting a digital avatar into the feed. But the IT director, a man named Marcus, who had been designing security systems for 30 years, was baffled. "It's not a loop," Marcus said, his fingers flying across a keyboard in the hub. "I am checking the source code of the video stream. This is a live, raw feed. There is no external data being injected. And look at the timestamps. They are synced to the millisecond with the atomic clock." Then Marcus did something brave, or maybe something stupid. "I want to see what happens if we touch the briefcase," Marcus said. On the monitors, the man in the suit had finally moved. He had walked into the center of the security hub. According to the cameras, the man was now standing right in the middle of the room between Arthur and the police officers. Of course, to the naked eye, the room was empty. "The briefcase is sitting right here," Marcus said, pointing to a spot on the floor that looked completely vacant. Marcus reached out his hand. He moved it through the air where the briefcase appeared to be on the monitor. "I do not feel anything," Marcus said. "It's just air." But then Arthur looked at the monitor. When Marcus's hand passed through the space where the briefcase was, the image of the briefcase flickered. It did not just disappear, it changed. For a split second, the leather briefcase on the screen turned into something else. It looked like an old rusted metal box. And the man in the suit, his image flickered too. For one frame, he was not a man in a suit. He was a skeleton in a tattered uniform. Arthur screamed, "Did you see that? Did you see the screen?" Everyone had seen it. The room went dead silent. "Marcus," Officer Miller said, her voice shaking, "check the archives. This building was built in 2012. What was here before?" Marcus began digging through the municipal records and the historical archives of the land. Because the Blackwood Corporate Center was built on what used to be a massive industrial site, the records were extensive. It took him 40 minutes to find it. "Okay," Marcus said, his face turning pale. In 1974, this entire plot of land was owned by a company called Aegis Research. They were a contractor for the Department of Defense. They were working on something called Project Kronos. Arthur leaned in. What was Project Kronos? "The records are mostly redacted," Marcus said, "but there was an accident. March 14th, 1974. Exactly 52 years ago tonight." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. Tonight is March 14th. An employee named Thomas Sterling was conducting an experiment involving high-frequency electromagnetic fields. Marcus continued reading. According to the report, there was a massive power surge. Sterling was standing in the middle of the lab. When the smoke cleared, he was gone. They never found his body. They never found his briefcase. They declared him dead, but they could not explain where he went. The report says, and I quote, "It is as if the subject was displaced from the linear progression of time. The final frame." The group in the security hub looked back at the monitor. The man in the charcoal suit, Thomas Sterling, was still there. He was still looking at them, but he was not pointing anymore. He was checking his watch. On the screen, Thomas Sterling looked at his wristwatch, then looked up at the camera and offered a very small, very sad smile. He picked up his briefcase, and then he began to fade. But he did not just vanish, he seemed to rewind. On the monitors, everyone watched as the man walked backward out of the security hub, down the hallway, into the elevator, and back to the third-floor lobby. He moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, as if the film of his life was being pulled back onto a reel. Finally, he stood in the exact center of the third-floor lobby where Arthur had first seen him. He looked up at the camera one last time. He opened his mouth, and though there was no audio, his lips clearly formed a single word: help. At exactly 3:33 in the morning, the image of Thomas Sterling vanished from every single monitor in the building. The motion sensors remained silent. The perfectly clean air in the vault remained undisturbed. The dusting of snow outside remained unmarked. The police conducted a full sweep of the building. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no hidden projectors, no high-tech hacking devices. The IT director spent the next 72 hours analyzing the hard drives. What he found was the most impossible part of all. When he looked at the recorded footage of that night, the man in the charcoal suit was there. He was on the tapes, clear as day. But when Marcus ran a forensic analysis on the video files, he discovered that the pixels that made up the image of Thomas Sterling were not digital, they were analog. It was as if a 1974 television signal had somehow bled into a 2026 digital stream. The man had not entered the building in the physical sense, he had overlapped with it. For 1 hour and 11 minutes, 2 different years had occupied the same space. Arthur Vance quit his job the next morning. He did not want a pension, he did not want a recommendation, he just wanted to be somewhere where he did not have to look at a screen. But there is one detail that Arthur never told the police. A few days after he quit, Arthur was at home looking through some old boxes of his own. He had served in the military in the late 70s, and he had a collection of old newspapers. He found a local clipping from March 15, 1974. The headline read, "Scientist Missing in Lab Explosion." There was a photo of Thomas Sterling. He was wearing the charcoal suit. He was holding the leather briefcase. But that was not what caught Arthur's eye. In the background of the photo, behind Thomas Sterling, there was a window. And in the reflection of that window, you could see a room that had not been built yet. In the reflection, you could see a wall of high-definition monitors, you could see a rolling chair, and you could see a 62-year-old man named Arthur Vance staring back with a look of absolute terror. Thomas Sterling had not just appeared on Arthur's cameras in 2026, Arthur had appeared in Thomas Sterling's world in 1974. And neither one of them could do anything to reach across the gap. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, please let me know. I can dive deeper into the technical files of Project Kronos, or perhaps we can look into the other displaced individuals that the Blackwood Corporate Center has reported since that night. Would you like me to find another case from the Blackwood archives for you? Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place because that is all we do here. Today, we are going to dive into a case that defies every law of physics, every rule of logic, and every bit of common sense we have about the physical world. This is a story about a man who spent his entire life in the wilderness, a man who thought he had seen everything the great outdoors had to throw at him until he came across a set of tracks that simply should not have existed. The silent sentinel of the Cascades, the Pacific Northwest, is a place of incredible, haunting beauty, but it is also a place that hides its secrets under a very thick blanket of pine needles and heavy mountain fog. In the late autumn of 1984, a man named Elias Thorne lived deep within the rugged interior of the Cascade Mountain Range in Washington state. Now, Elias was not your typical mountain man. He was 62 years old, a retired search and rescue officer who had spent over 35 years pulling lost hikers out of ravines and finding hunters who had wandered too far off the trail. Elias was a man of cold, hard facts. He did not believe in Bigfoot, he believed in bear tracks. He did not believe in ghosts. He believed in the way the wind could whistle through a hollowed-out cedar tree to make it sound like a human scream. He was a man grounded in the reality of the earth. He lived in a hand-built cabin located about 20 miles from the nearest paved road. His only companion was a black Labrador named Jasper, and his only connection to the outside world was a high-frequency radio that he checked once a week. One Tuesday morning in early November, Elias woke up to a world that had been turned completely white. A massive, unexpected snowstorm had rolled in through the night, dumping nearly 2 feet of fresh, powdery snow across the landscape. The air was deathly still, that heavy, muffled silence that only happens when the world is buried under a deep freeze. Elias poured himself a cup of black coffee, put on his heavy wool coat, and stepped out onto his porch to clear the stairs. Jasper, usually eager to jump into the snow, stayed behind Elias's legs, his low growl vibrating in his chest. Elias did not think much of it at first. He figured there was a coyote or maybe a cougar prowling nearby, lured in by the smell of the cured meats in his smokehouse. But as Elias looked down at the pristine, untouched snow in his front yard, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The impossible trail. Starting exactly 3 feet from his front porch, not coming from the woods, not coming from the road, but just starting out of thin air, were a set of footprints. They were not animal tracks. They were the prints of a human being. But there were several things wrong with them immediately. First, the person was barefoot. In 2 feet of snow, with temperatures hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, someone had been walking around without boots. Second, the prints were deep, not because the snow was soft, but because they looked like they had been pressed into the ground with immense weight. But the third thing, the thing that made Elias's grip tighten on his shovel, was the shape. The footprints had 6 toes. Elias stepped off his porch, his own heavy boots sinking deep into the powder. He knelt down to examine the first print. It was perfect. You could see the swirl of the skin on the bottom of the foot, the indentation of every toe, and the sharp press of the heel. But here was the kicker. There was no drag in the snow. Usually, when you walk through deep snow, your feet leave a trail, a plow mark where your leg moves from one step to the next. These prints looked like they had been stamped straight down from the sky. One print, then a 3-foot gap of perfectly smooth, undisturbed snow, then the next print. Elias looked out toward the tree line. The tracks led straight away from his cabin, heading toward a dense thicket of old-growth hemlock trees. Elias went back inside, grabbed his .30-06 rifle, whistled for Jasper, who refused to move from the rug, and decided he had to follow these tracks. In his mind, there was a rational explanation. Maybe a hiker was in trouble, maybe someone was playing a prank, but the search and rescue officer in him knew that a barefoot person in this weather would be dead within 20 minutes. The loop to nowhere, Elias followed the 6-toed tracks for over 2 miles. The trail was a straight line, cutting through the forest with terrifying precision. It did not weave around trees, it went through the tightest gaps. At one point, the tracks led directly up to the base of a massive frozen rock face, a vertical wall of stone about 30 feet high. Elias stopped, squinting through the mountain glare. The tracks went right to the base of the cliff, and then they appeared again at the very top. There were no handholds, no signs of a climb, and certainly no equipment. It was as if the person had simply walked up the vertical wall like it was a flat sidewalk. Elias had to hike a half-mile detour to get around the ridge and reach the top of that rock face. When he finally got there, sweating despite the cold, he found the tracks again. They continued on the other side, still barefoot, still 6 toes, still no drag marks in the snow. But then, the tracks did something that defied all logic. About 4 miles into the woods, Elias reached a clearing known as Devil's Punch Bowl. It was a circular meadow that in the winter became a perfect flat white disc. The tracks walked directly into the center of the meadow, and then they just stopped. Elias walked in a wide circle around the tracks, looking for where they might have jumped or turned around. Nothing. The snow, for 50 yards in every direction, was like a sheet of white glass. The tracks simply ended in the middle of the field. He stood there for 10 minutes, the silence of the woods pressing against his ears. He felt like he was being watched. He checked his rifle, making sure a round was chambered. Just as he was about to turn back, he noticed something in the distance, on the far side of the meadow. Another set of tracks. He ran over to them, his breath coming in heavy, ragged plumes of steam. He looked down and his heart skipped a beat. They were the same tracks, 6 toes, barefoot, but they were heading back the way he had just come. He followed them, thinking he was chasing the person now. He pushed himself harder, his 62-year-old lungs burning. The tracks led him back toward the rock face, back through the hemlock thicket, and finally back into the clearing where his cabin stood. Elias stopped at the edge of his yard, his rifle raised to his shoulder. The tracks led directly up to his front porch. They ended exactly where they had started, 3 feet from his door. But there was a new set of tracks now. While Elias had been out in the woods for 4 hours, someone or something had walked out of his front door, followed his original path for 10 feet, then stopped, turned around, and walked back inside. Elias knew for a fact he had locked his door. He lived alone. Jasper was the only soul inside that house. The house guest, Elias approached his cabin with the stealth of a predator. He could see through the front window. The fire he had built in the hearth was still roaring, casting a warm orange glow across the living room. Jasper was nowhere to be seen. He stepped onto the porch. The door was still locked. He took his key out with trembling fingers, inserted it into the deadbolt, and turned it. Click. He pushed the door open, his rifle leading the way. "Hello?" he shouted. "I am armed! Show yourself!" Silence. The cabin was exactly as he had left it. His coffee cup was still on the table, a thin film of cold oil on the surface of the liquid. But Jasper was gone. Elias whistled, called the dog's name, and searched under the bed and in the loft. Nothing. Then he noticed the floor. His cabin floor was made of polished pine planks. In the center of the room, right in front of the fireplace, there were wet, steaming footprints. 6 toes, barefoot. The water from the melting snow was still bubbling slightly, as if the feet that left them were unnaturally hot. Elias knelt down and touched the water. It was not just warm, it was near boiling. He pulled his hand back, his skin red. He looked toward the back of the cabin, toward the small cellar door he used to store his canned goods for the winter. The cellar door was hanging open. Elias took a deep breath, gripped his rifle, and headed toward the dark opening in the floor. He flicked on his heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom of the basement. He descended the wooden stairs, each step creaking like a gunshot in the still air. When he reached the bottom, he swung the light around. The cellar was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. It was lined with shelves of peaches, green beans, and salted venison. In the far corner, he saw Jasper. The dog was curled into a ball, shaking so violently that his claws were clicking against the stone floor. But Jasper was not looking at Elias. He was looking at the ceiling. Elias slowly tilted his flashlight upward. There, on the rafters of the cellar, directly above his head, were the footprints. They were not just marks. They were burned into the wood. 6-toed, barefoot prints that walked across the ceiling, went down the far wall, and disappeared into a crack in the foundation that was not even 2 inches wide. And next to the last footprint, written in the soot of the wood, were 4 words, "Not long enough away." The aftermath. Elias Thorne did not sleep that night. He sat in his chair with his rifle across his lap, and every light in the house turned on. The next morning, as soon as the sun cracked the horizon, he packed a single bag, put Jasper in the back of his old Ford truck, and drove. He did not stop until he reached the town of Ellensburg, nearly 80 miles away. He went straight to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a man named Miller, who had known Elias for 20 years, listened to the story. He did not laugh. He knew Elias was not a man given to flights of fancy. The sheriff and 2 deputies drove back up to the cabin with Elias that afternoon. When they arrived, the snow was still there, but the sun had been out for a few hours. They looked for the tracks in the yard. They were gone. Not melted, just gone. The snow, where the tracks had been, was perfectly smooth, as if it had never been stepped on. They went inside the cabin. The wet footprints on the pine floor? Gone. No water stains, no heat, nothing. They went down into the cellar. They found the rafters. There were no burn marks. There was no soot. There was no writing. Sheriff Miller looked at Elias with a mix of pity and concern. "Elias, it has been a long winter. Maybe the isolation is getting to you." Elias did not argue. He could not. He looked at the rafters where he had seen the marks with his own 2 eyes, and he saw nothing but dusty old wood. But as they were leaving, Jasper refused to go back inside the house to get his dog bowl. The dog stood at the edge of the driveway, tail between his legs, whimpering at the front door. Elias moved to a small apartment in the city and never returned to the mountains. He sold the cabin to a developer a year later. 5 years after that, in 1990, the developer sent Elias a letter. They had been tearing down the cabin to build a larger vacation home. When they ripped up the floorboards in the living room, they found something tucked away in the insulation. It was a photograph. It was a picture of Elias Thorne, taken from outside his window on the very morning of the snowstorm. In the photo, Elias is standing at his stove, pouring a cup of coffee. But in the reflection of the window, standing right behind Elias, so close their shoulders were almost touching, was a figure. It was tall, pale, and completely hairless. It had no face, just smooth white skin where eyes and a mouth should be, and it was holding a hand up to the glass. The hand had 6 fingers. On the back of the photo, written in the same soot-black lettering Elias had seen in the cellar, were the words, "I am back again. Elias Thorne passed away 3 days after receiving that letter." The cause of death was listed as natural causes, but those who saw him in his final hours said he looked like a man who had seen the end of the world. He was found in his bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, and when the coroner turned his body over to prepare him for the funeral, they found something they could not explain. On the soles of Elias's feet, burned deep into the skin as if by a branding iron, were 2 perfect 6-toed footprints. The Pacific Northwest remains a place of mystery. People go missing in those woods every single year, thousands of them. Most are found, some are never heard from again. But if you ever find yourself hiking in the Cascades after a fresh snow, and you see a set of tracks that do not have any drag marks, and they seem to lead nowhere, do yourself a favor. Do not follow them. Because you might just find that they lead right back to you. I have provided the story without any of the requested formatting marks and ensured that all numbers and dates are spelled out in American English. Would you like me to create another story involving a different mysterious urban legend or true crime case? Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do here. Today's story is about a man who lived a perfectly ordinary, quiet life in the rural reaches of New England until one rainy Tuesday evening when the laws of physics and the very fabric of his reality decided to simply stop making sense. The man in the mirror of the world, Arthur Penhaligon, was 64 years old, and he lived in a house that was arguably older than the town of Oak Haven, Vermont itself. The house was a sprawling 3-story Victorian structure built back in 1887 by a wealthy shipping merchant who clearly had a penchant for dark wood, narrow hallways, and windows that seemed to stare back at you with a life of their own. For 32 years, Arthur had shared this home with his wife, Martha. They had filled those rooms with laughter, with the smell of baking bread, and with the comfortable silence of 2 people who knew each other's thoughts before they were even spoken. But after Martha passed away in 2022, the house had grown significantly quieter, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch just a little bit longer every evening. Arthur was a man of habit. He was a retired history professor, a man who dealt in facts, dates, and verifiable evidence. He woke up at 6 o'clock every morning, drank exactly 2 cups of black coffee while reading the local newspaper, and spent his afternoons tending to a garden that was frequently besieged by the local deer population. He was not a man given to flights of fancy, he did not believe in ghosts, he did not believe in unidentified flying objects, and he certainly did not believe in the impossible. To Arthur, the world was a series of logical events and physical laws. If a door creaked, it was the hinges reacting to humidity. If a light flickered, it was the ancient wiring of a house built in the 19th century. But on the night of October 14th, 2025, Arthur's logic was going to be put to the ultimate test. It was roughly 7:45 in the evening. A relentless autumn rain was drumming against the slate roof, creating a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that usually put Arthur at ease. He was in the kitchen, standing at the porcelain sink, washing a single ceramic plate from his dinner. The kitchen was brightly lit by a hanging fluorescent fixture that buzzed with a low, steady hum, a sound that usually annoyed him but tonight felt strangely grounding. Outside, the world was a void of pitch black, save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the skeletal branches of the ancient oak trees in the backyard. The wind was whipping through the valley, rattling the window panes and making the old house groan like a living thing. Arthur reached for a dish towel, his eyes drifting toward the window above the sink. Now, normally, because it was so bright inside the kitchen and so dark outside, the window acted as a perfect mirror. He could see himself clearly, a tall, slightly stooped man with thinning silver hair and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He saw his own reflection staring back at him, mimicking his every move with the absolute precision that physics demands. He dried the plate. The reflection dried the plate. He blinked. The reflection blinked. But then, Arthur felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. It was not the kind of chill you get from a drafty window or a drop in temperature. It was the kind of chill that starts in the very center of your bones and radiates outward until your skin prickles with dread. It was the primal feeling of being watched. Not by a stranger hiding in the bushes, but by something much closer, something that shouldn't be there at all. Arthur turned his head slightly to the left to look toward the kitchen doorway, wondering if he had left the cellar door open. In the reflection of the window, he saw his image turn its head to the left as well. Everything was normal, or so it seemed for a fleeting second. He turned back to face the window directly. And that is when his heart skipped a beat and a cold lump of lead formed in his stomach. In the reflection, the Arthur on the other side of the glass was no longer drying a plate. He was standing perfectly still. His hands were down at his sides, resting loosely. But the real Arthur, the living, breathing man standing inside the kitchen, was still holding the dish towel and the ceramic plate. Arthur froze. He stared at his reflection, waiting for it to catch up, waiting for his brain to explain away the visual lag. Maybe it was a trick of the light? Maybe the flickering fluorescent bulb was creating some kind of stroboscopic effect that made movement appear disjointed? He held his breath, his eyes wide, searching for a rational explanation that simply would not come. But as he watched, the man in the window, the version of himself that should have been a mere trick of light and glass, slowly raised a hand and pointed. He did not point at Arthur. He pointed past him toward the back door of the kitchen that led out to the mudroom. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. He slowly looked down at his own hands. He was still holding the towel. He was still holding the plate. His hands were right there in front of his chest. He looked back at the window. The reflection was still pointing toward the door, its eyes locked onto Arthur with an intensity that was terrifying. And then the reflection did something that should have been physically impossible. It did something that violated every rule of optics ever discovered. It stepped backward. In a normal reflection, if you step back from a mirror, your image appears to move further away into the distance of the reflected room. But that is not what happened here. The Arthur in the window did not move deeper into the reflected kitchen. Instead, he stepped out of the frame of the reflection entirely. Arthur watched, paralyzed by a mixture of shock and sheer horror, as his likeness walked across the dark, rain-soaked backyard outside. The two Arthur's brain scrambled to find a rational explanation. It is a prowler, he thought. Someone who looks remarkably like me is in my backyard. Someone is playing a cruel, elaborate prank. But deep down, in the part of the human brain that recognizes the self, he knew that was not it. The man outside was not just a lookalike. He was wearing the exact same green and blue flannel shirt, right down to the missing button on the left cuff that Arthur had meant to sew back on for 3 weeks. He had the same peculiar limp in his right leg from a fall he had taken off a ladder back in 1998. Arthur dropped the plate. It shattered on the linoleum floor into a dozen jagged pieces, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet house. But he did not even look down. His eyes were locked on the figure outside. The man, the outside Arthur, walked through the pouring rain with a slow, deliberate pace. He did not seem to mind the water soaking through his clothes or the wind whipping his hair. He walked until he was about 15 feet away from the window, right under the glow of the motion sensor floodlight that had just clicked on. Under the harsh white light of the floodlight, there was no mistaking it. It was him. It was Arthur Penhaligon standing in the rain, looking in at himself. The outside Arthur stopped and turned around. He looked directly through the glass at the inside Arthur. His face was devoid of emotion. It was not a face of malice, but it was not friendly either. It was a face of profound, hollow recognition, like looking at a photograph of a person who had been forgotten for decades. Inside the kitchen, Arthur felt a wave of nausea. He reached out and gripped the edge of the laminate counter to keep from collapsing. "This is not happening," he whispered to the empty room. "This is a stroke. I am having a major neurological event. I need to call 911. He squeezed his eyes shut and counted to 5, hoping that when he opened them, the world would be right again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When he opened them, the man was still there, but he was closer now. He was standing just 5 feet from the window, the rain dripping off the tip of his nose. The outside Arthur raised his hand and pressed his palm against the glass. Inside the kitchen, Arthur looked at the window. On the outside of the pane, a wet, blurred handprint appeared where the man was touching it. But here is the part that defied every law of nature. Arthur felt a sensation on the palm of his own hand. He was not touching the window. His hands were still gripping the edge of the counter, white-knuckled and shaking, and yet he felt the distinct, icy-cold pressure of wet glass pushing against his right palm. It was a tactile hallucination so vivid it made his skin crawl. He looked down at his hand. It was bone dry, but the sensation was undeniable. It was as if his nervous system had been hijacked by the man standing in the rain. The outside Arthur then began to speak. His lips moved in perfect synchronization, but no sound came through the glass. However, Arthur did not need to hear him with his ears. He could hear the words inside his own head, vibrating against his skull in his own voice, but with a resonance that felt ancient. "Arthur," the voice said, "you are still inside. Why are you still inside?" Arthur's legs finally gave out. He sank to the floor, surrounded by the shards of his broken plate. He crawled away from the window, dragging himself into the hallway where the darkness offered a meager sense of protection. He scrambled into the living room and huddled in his armchair, the one Martha used to sit in when she knitted during the winter months. He sat there for what felt like hours, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He kept his eyes fixed on the hallway, waiting for the front door to burst open, waiting for his double to walk in and claim the rest of reality. He held a heavy brass fire poker in his hand, his knuckles aching from the grip, but the house remained silent. The only sound was the rain and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a clock that had been in his family for 75 years and had never missed a beat. The displacement. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the rain had stopped. The clouds parted, allowing a pale, sickly moon to cast long, distorted shadows across the living room floor. Arthur had not moved. He was exhausted, his mind frayed at the edges, but he was too terrified to close his eyes. He eventually mustered the courage to stand up. He had to know if the man was still there. He had to know if he had finally lost his mind or if the world had truly broken. He walked slowly back toward the kitchen. He moved like a man walking through a minefield. When he reached the doorway, he peered around the corner, his heart in his throat. The kitchen was empty. The broken plates still lay on the floor, a mess of white ceramic. The window was dark again, the floodlight having timed out long ago. Arthur approached the sink. He looked at the window. This time, his reflection was back to normal. It followed his movements perfectly. He sighed, a long, shaky breath of relief that nearly brought him to tears. A hallucination, he told himself. Dehydration, stress, grief. He decided he needed to clean up the broken glass before he cut himself. He reached for the broom in the pantry, swept up the shards, and tossed them into the trash can. As he leaned over the sink to rinse his hands, he glanced at the window one more time. That is when he noticed the handprint. On the inside of the glass, there was a faint, foggy handprint. Arthur stared at it. He had not touched the glass. He reached out and ran his finger across the mark. It was on the inside. It was oily, like a fingerprint, but the ridges were wrong. They were inverted. But as he touched it, he noticed something else. Something far worse than a stray mark on the glass. He looked at his own reflection in the window. The reflection was looking back at him, but it looked different. It looked warmer, more vibrant. The reflection's skin had a healthy, youthful glow, while Arthur noticed his own hands looked pale, almost translucent. He looked down at his arms. He could see the blue veins beneath his skin, but they looked faint, as if they were fading away like an old watercolor painting left in the rain. He looked at the flannel shirt he was wearing. The colors seemed duller, the greens and blues turning into shades of gray. He looked back at the reflection. The reflection was smiling now. It was a small, sad smile, full of pity. The reflection, Arthur raised a hand, the right hand, and Arthur watched as his own right hand rose in unison. But he was not the one moving it. His arm felt light, weightless, as if it were being pulled upward by invisible strings. Then the reflection spoke. This time, the sound did not happen in Arthur's head. It came from the kitchen itself, but it did not come from Arthur's mouth. It came from the window. "It is time to trade, Arthur," the reflection said. Arthur tried to scream, but no sound came out. He felt a sudden, violent sensation of being pulled forward, as if a vacuum had opened up in front of him. It felt like being caught in the powerful undertow of a wave. The kitchen began to blur. The walls, the stove, the refrigerator, they all seemed to stretch and distort like taffy. He felt his face press against the cold surface of the window, but he did not hit the glass. He went through it. There was a moment of intense, biting cold, the feeling of being submerged in an ice bath in the middle of January. And then he felt the wind. He felt the dampness of the night air. He felt the wet grass beneath his feet. Arthur stumbled backward, gasping for air that tasted of wet earth and pine. He looked around. He was standing in his backyard. The grass was soaked. The oak trees loomed above him like silent giants. He whirled around to look at the house. There, standing inside the kitchen, was Arthur. The new Arthur was standing at the sink, looking out the window with an expression of immense relief. He looked solid. He looked real. He looked like a man who had finally come home after a very long and weary journey. The new Arthur reached up and shut the kitchen window. He locked it with a definitive, metallic click. He then reached for the light switch and flipped it. The kitchen went dark. Arthur, the Arthur, now standing in the rain, rushed to the window. He pounded on the glass with all his might. "Let me in!" he screamed. "That is my house. That is my life." But his fists made no sound against the glass. It was like hitting a wall of solid, cold stone. He looked down at his hands. They were nearly transparent now. He could see the wet blades of grass right through his palms. He looked toward the living room window. He saw the new Arthur walk into the room. He saw him sit down in Martha's armchair. He saw him pick up a book and begin to read. Arthur spent the rest of the night screaming, pacing the perimeter of the house, trying every door and every window. They were all locked. Not just locked, but impenetrable. He was a ghost in his own yard, a shadow cast by a man who had stolen his very existence. The residual. When the sun began to rise on the morning of October 15th, Arthur expected to vanish. He expected the light of day to dissolve whatever was left of his fading soul. But he did not vanish, he just became less. He stood by the edge of the woods, watching as the new Arthur came out onto the back porch at 6 o'clock sharp. The new Arthur was carrying a steaming cup of coffee. He took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, looked toward the woods directly at where Arthur was standing, and nodded. It was not a nod of malice. It was a nod of thanks. For the next 3 days, Arthur watched his life continue without him. He watched the new Arthur go to the grocery store. He watched him talk to the neighbor, Mr. Henderson, about the local high school football scores and the upcoming frost. He even watched the new Arthur visit Martha's grave at the cemetery 3 miles down the road, laying fresh flowers on the stone. The new Arthur was better at being Arthur than Arthur had been. He was more patient. He laughed more. He seemed to cherish the simple act of breathing in a way that the original Arthur had forgotten to do. By the fourth day, Arthur found that he could no longer stay near the house. An invisible force seemed to be pushing him further and further away toward the dark woods that bordered the property. He was fading. His memories of Martha, of his childhood in Ohio, of the 64 years he had spent on Earth, were becoming like old photographs left in the sun, bleached and unrecognizable. He realized then that he was not a ghost in the traditional sense. He was a displacement, a glitch in the continuity of a single soul. There is an old theory in certain esoteric circles that suggests we are not single entities, but a series of reflections scattered across multiple layers of reality. Usually, these layers never touch. They are separated by the ironclad laws of time and space. But every once in a long while, a door opens, a window becomes more than a window. And the person on the outside decides they have spent enough time in the dark. Arthur Penhaligon was never seen again by the people of Oakhaven. Or rather, he was seen every day, but nobody noticed that the man walking down Main Street was the one who had been standing on the outside looking in. As for the original Arthur, if you go to that patch of woods in Vermont on a rainy October night and you stand very still near the old Victorian house on the hill, you might feel a sudden, inexplicable chill. You might see a faint, shimmering outline of a man in a flannel shirt, standing under an oak tree, staring at the kitchen window with a look of profound longing. But whatever you do not look too closely at your own reflection when the lights are bright inside and the world is dark outside, because you might just see yourself standing out there and you might realize that the you inside is the one who is running out of time, the aftermath. The story of Arthur Penhaligon is not just a tale of a haunting. It is a cautionary account of what happens when the impossible becomes inevitable. In the weeks following the switch, the local authorities in Oakhaven received a single strange phone call. It came from the Penhaligon residence on the night of October 18th. When the dispatcher answered, there was nothing but the sound of heavy rain and a faint, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on glass with a fingernail. The dispatcher, a woman named Sarah, who had worked the night shift for 22 years, asked if there was an emergency. A voice finally came through. It was Arthur's voice, or at least the voice that belonged to the man living in Arthur's house. "I just wanted to report a trespasser," the voice said. It was calm, almost peaceful. "Can you describe the individual, sir?" Sarah asked, her pen hovering over the logbook. There was a long pause. The sound of a door being locked could be heard in the background. "He looks just like me," the voice replied. "But do not worry, he cannot get in anymore. I have made sure of that." When the police arrived at the house 20 minutes later to conduct a welfare check, they found Arthur Penhaligon sitting in his living room sipping a cup of herbal tea. He was perfectly polite, perfectly sane, and completely alone. He told the officers that he had had a bit of a scare with a shadow in the yard, but it turned out to be nothing more than a trick of the moonlight on the wet trees. The officers left, noting in their report that Mr. Penhaligon seemed to be in better spirits than he had been since his wife's passing. They remarked on how vibrant and healthy he looked for a man of his age. But as they drove away down the long gravel driveway, the younger officer looked back at the house. He swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. A figure that did not move even as the patrol car's headlights swept over it. A figure that seemed to be made of nothing but gray mist and regret. He did not say anything to his partner. In a town like Oakhaven, you learn quickly that some things are better left unsaid. You learn that logic is a thin veil we pull over our eyes to keep from seeing the vast, terrifying contradictions of the universe. Arthur Penhaligon, the one who remained inside, lived for another 15 years. He became a beloved fixture of the community, he volunteered at the library, he donated to the local animal shelter, and he never once missed a Sunday service. He was, by all accounts, a man who loved life. But he never again looked into a mirror after the sun went down. He covered every reflective surface in his home with heavy velvet cloths the moment the clock struck 6. He lived in a house of shrouded glass, terrified that one day he would look into a darkened window and see a man in a flannel shirt standing in the rain, and that the man would want his turn back. If you found this story interesting, I can certainly dive into more accounts of the doppelganger phenomenon or other strange phenomena involving the folding of time and space. Would you like me to research more cases of people who encountered their own doubles in impossible circumstances? Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do here. Today, we are going on a journey into the deep, damp woods of the Pacific Northwest to look at a case that truly defies everything we think we know about the linear nature of time and the physical reality of our world. This is a story about a man named Elias Thorne, a man who spent his entire life learning how to read the earth, only to find that the earth was reading him back in a way that should have been physically impossible. The man who knew the woods. To understand this story, you first have to understand who Elias Thorne was. In the year 1994, Elias was 54 years old. He was a man of the outdoors, a retired forest ranger who had spent over 30 years patrolling the rugged terrain of the Cascade Mountains in Washington state. He was not just a guy who liked to hike, he was a master tracker. He could look at a bent blade of grass and tell you not only that a deer had passed through, but how long ago it happened, which direction it was headed, and whether or not it was startled. Elias lived alone in a small, hand-built cabin about 20 miles outside of a tiny town called Packwood. He liked the solitude. For Elias, the woods were not scary or unpredictable. They followed a set of rules. Gravity worked, seasons changed, tracks were made by things that were actually there. On a cold Tuesday morning in late October, Elias decided to head out for what he thought would be a routine scouting trip. He wanted to check the high ridges before the first heavy snow of the season blocked the passes. He packed his canvas rucksack with the essentials, a stainless steel thermos filled with black coffee, 2 ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a compass, and his trusty binoculars. He laced up his boots, a pair of custom-made, heavy-duty leather hikers with a very specific, aggressive tread pattern that he had worn for the last 5 years. As he stepped off his porch, the air was crisp, hovering right around 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground was soft from a light rain that had fallen the night before, creating the perfect canvas for a tracker. He felt the weight of his gear, a familiar comfort that had accompanied him through thousands of miles of wilderness. He was a man who moved with purpose, his gait steady and practiced, a product of decades spent navigating the uneven floor of the forest. The first anomaly, Elias hiked for about 3 hours, climbing steadily into the higher elevations where the Douglas firs give way to subalpine meadows. He reached a plateau known as Dead Man's Ridge. It was a desolate, beautiful place that looked out over a valley that seemed to stretch on forever. The ridge was a narrow spine of land, flanked by steep drops on either side, and it was notorious among locals for its sudden mists and the way sound seemed to travel in strange directions. He stopped to take a drink of his coffee, leaning against a large granite boulder. The silence was absolute. There was no wind, no birds chirping, just the heavy, muffled quiet of the mountains. He looked down at the mud near his feet, and that is when he saw it. About 10 feet away from where he was standing, there was a clear set of footprints. Now, seeing footprints on a trail is not strange, but Dead Man's Ridge was remote. Elias had not seen another soul all day, and he had not seen any tracks on the trail leading up here. He walked over to investigate, his internal ranger brain already clicking into gear. He knelt down and looked at the first print. His heart skipped a beat. The tracks were fresh. And when I say fresh, I mean they looked like they had been made seconds ago. The edges of the mud were still sharp, the water had not even begun to seep into the depressions yet. But that was not what stopped his breath in his lungs. It was the tread. Elias looked down at his own feet, then back at the tracks. The prints in the mud were from a size 11 boot. They had the exact same aggressive V pattern as his own, but it went deeper than that. On Elias's left boot, there was a very specific nick in the rubber heel where he had stepped on a sharp piece of obsidian 2 years prior. The tracks in the mud had that exact same nick. Elias stood up, his pulse beginning to thrum in his ears. He looked around the empty ridge. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. The plateau was open for at least 200 yards in every direction. These stunted alpine trees offered no cover for a grown man. "Hello," he called out. His voice felt thin and fragile against the vastness of the mountains. There was no answer, only the sound of his own breathing, which had become rapid and shallow. He looked at the tracks again. They were not coming from anywhere. They simply started in the middle of the clearing and headed west toward a dense thicket of hemlock trees. Elias checked his own path. He had come from the south. He had not walked over that patch of mud. He began to follow them, driven by a mixture of professional curiosity and a growing cold knot of dread in his stomach. He counted the paces. 1, 2, 3, 4. The tracks were spaced exactly like his own gait. They were not running, they were walking at a steady, methodical pace. As he followed them toward the trees, he noticed something else. Beside the footprints, there were small, circular indentations in the soft earth. Elias reached into his rucksack and pulled out his walking stick. He pressed the tip into the mud. It matched the indentations perfectly. He was following himself. But he was right here. The impossible evidence Elias pushed into the hemlock thicket, the branches clawing at his jacket. The tracks continued, weaving through the trees with a familiarity that Elias recognized. This was the exact route he usually took when he wanted to bypass the steep scree slope on the other side of the ridge. He knew every root, every mossy stone. He came to a small clearing where a fallen log sat rotting in the dampness. The tracks stopped at the log. It looked like whoever made them had sat down for a moment. Elias looked down and saw a small silver object glinting in the moss. He reached down and picked it up. It was a gum wrapper, a brand of cinnamon gum that Elias had been chewing for 20 years. He reached into his own pocket and felt his pack of gum. It was there. But the wrapper on the ground was not old. It was not weathered by the rain or faded by the sun. It was dry. It smelled faintly of cinnamon. It was as if someone had just unwrapped a piece and tossed the foil aside a mere minute ago. At this point, Elias was trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe some hiker had stolen his boots and his gum, but that made no sense. He lived alone. He had not seen anyone, and how could they have been right in front of him without him hearing a single sound? The forest floor, while damp, still had plenty of dry twigs and brittle needles that would snap under the weight of a person. He kept going. The tracks led out of the thicket and toward the edge of a steep ravine. This was a dangerous area, where the ground was unstable and dropped off about 60 feet into a rocky creek bed. As he approached the edge, he saw something that made him freeze. The tracks ahead of him began to change. The stride became longer. The toe prints were deeper than the heels. Whoever or whatever was making these tracks had started to run. They were fleeing toward the cliffside. Elias began to jog, his heavy boots thudding against the earth. He reached the edge of the ravine and looked down. There, about 40 feet down the slope, snagged on a gnarled root of a mountain hemlock, was a piece of red fabric. Elias looked at his own arm. He was wearing a red flannel shirt under his heavy canvas coat. He checked his sleeves. They were intact. He checked his torso. Every button was in place, but he could not leave it. He carefully scrambled down the slope, his fingers digging into the cold dirt. He reached the root and unhooked the fabric. It was a pocket torn cleanly off a red flannel shirt. It even had the white thread hanging from the edges where it had been ripped from the main garment. Inside the pocket was a small brass compass. Elias pulled his own compass out of his rucksack. It was a gift from his father, given to him in 1958. It had a very specific scratch on the glass in the shape of a lightning bolt across the north, marking. He looked at the compass he had just found in the dirt. It was the same compass. The scratch was there, the brass was tarnished in the exact same spots. The leather cord was frayed in the same manner. He looked back up the hill, his mind reeling. He was holding two identical, unique items. One from his pocket and one from a version of him that seemed to be ahead of him in time. It was a physical paradox that his mind could not resolve. He felt a wave of vertigo wash over him, and that is when he heard it. From just over the next rise, about 50 yards away, came the sound of a heavy thud. Then, a sharp, guttural cry of pain. It was his own voice. The confrontation with the self, Elias did not think. He did not weigh the impossibility of the situation. He just moved. He scrambled back up the ravine, his lungs burning in the thin mountain air. He was 54 years old, but in that moment, he moved with the agility of a man in his 20s. Adrenaline is a powerful thing, especially when mixed with the sheer terror of the unknown. He crested the rise, expecting to see a man lying on the ground. He expected to see a version of himself injured and bleeding. Instead, he saw nothing. The meadow was empty, the wind had finally picked up, whistling through the high grass. But there, in the center of the meadow, was a fresh patch of disturbed earth. Elias walked toward it, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He found a spot where the grass had been flattened. There were signs of a struggle, deep gouges in the dirt as if someone had been dragged. And there, lying in the middle of the mess, was his stainless steel thermos. He picked it up, it was dented, he touched the metal, it was still warm. He unscrewed the cap, and steam rose into the cold air. The smell of his specific burnt roast coffee filled his nostrils. He had just filled that thermos 4 hours ago in his kitchen. He looked at the tracks again. They led away from the struggle, but they were no longer walking. They were dragging something heavy. The tracks of the attacker were strange, broad, flat, and featureless, like someone had wrapped their feet in burlap or thick cloth. They left no tread, just an ominous, smooth depression in the mud. But the tracks of the victim, those were his boots, the size 11 hikers with the nick in the left heel. They were being dragged backward, the heels digging deep grooves into the soil as the person fought for purchase. Elias followed the drag marks. He followed them for 100 yards, then 200. They led straight toward the edge of a massive cliff known as the Devil's Drop. As he got closer to the edge, the sense of dread became overwhelming. He felt a wave of nausea. It was the feeling of a wrongness in the universe, a glitch in the fabric of how things are supposed to work. The air felt thick, almost like he was walking through water. He reached the very edge of the drop-off and looked down. The cliff fell away for 500 feet into a jagged pile of boulders. Down there, amidst the gray stone, he saw a flash of red. He pulled out his binoculars, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold them steady. He dialed the focus, his eyes stinging from the wind. Down on the rocks, he saw a man. The man was lying face down. He was wearing a canvas coat and a red flannel shirt. One of the pockets was missing. Elias felt a cold shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He looked down at his own hands. They were the hands of a living man, but down there, that was him. He could see the gray hair, the familiar shape of the shoulders, the boots. But wait, if that was him, then who was he? He looked back at the drag marks. They stopped right at the edge. But as he looked closer at the final footprints, the ones made by the attacker, he noticed something that made his blood turn to ice. The burlap-wrapped tracks did not stop at the edge. They did not turn around. They simply vanished. There were no tracks leading away, and then he heard the sound of footsteps. Not from below, not from the woods, from behind him. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Someone was walking up the slope toward him. Elias spun around, reaching for the hunting knife he kept on his belt. He braced himself, his eyes searching the tree line. He was ready to fight for his life, even if he didn't understand what he was fighting. Out of the shadows of the hemlocks stepped a figure. It was a man. He was wearing a canvas coat and a red flannel shirt. He looked tired. He looked older than Elias remembered being this morning. His face was covered in a week's worth of gray stubble. His eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles of exhaustion. The man stopped 10 feet away. He looked at Elias with eyes that were filled with an infinite, weary sadness. Elias stared at the man. It was like looking into a mirror that showed him what he would look like in 10 years, or maybe 20. The man had the same scar on his chin from a fishing accident in 1974. He had the same slightly crooked nose. Elias, the man said. His voice was a rasp, like sandpaper on wood. It was his voice, but aged by decades of silence. Who are you? Elias whispered, though he already knew the answer. I am the one who did not fall, the man said. The stranger stepped closer. Every time we come to this ridge, it happens. You follow the tracks, you find the compass, you find the thermos, you look over the edge, and then the thing comes out of the trees. Elias felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. What thing? The older version of himself pointed toward the thicket of hemlocks Elias had just walked through. The thing that has no face. The thing that wraps its feet in cloth so it makes no sound. It has been hunting us since 1972, Elias. You just did not know it until today. Elias shook his head. This is not real. This is some kind of mountain fever. I am dreaming. You are not dreaming, the older man said. Look at your watch. Elias looked at his wrist. His watch, a sturdy mechanical piece, was spinning. The hands were whirring around the dial so fast they were a blur. The date window was clicking through numbers at a dizzying speed. It went from 1994 to 1999 to 2010, in the span of a few seconds. Time is thin here, the older man said. The ridge is a loop. You are the past me. I am the future me. And down there, he gestured to the body on the rocks, is the version of us that was not fast enough to pull the knife. Elias gripped his knife tighter. So what happens now? The older man looked back toward the trees. His expression shifted from sadness to pure, unadulterated terror. Now, he whispered, you run. Because it is right behind me. The hunt in the mist Elias did not wait to see what it was. He turned and bolted. He did not run back toward the trail. He knew the trail was a trap. He ran toward the rocky scree slope, the most difficult terrain on the mountain. He figured if this thing had wrapped feet, it would struggle on the loose, sharp stones. As he ran, he could hear the sounds of a pursuit, but it was not the sound of one person. It was the sound of dozens. He heard the rhythmic thud of boots, his boots. He heard the scritch of the burlap-wrapped feet. He heard the heavy breathing of a man in his 50s. He heard the lighter, faster footsteps of a man in his 20s. He looked over his shoulder and saw a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The ridge was no longer empty. It was crowded with versions of himself. There were dozens of Elias Thorns. Some were young, looking like they were in their 30s. Some were old and frail, hobbling with canes. Some were covered in blood. Some were translucent, like ghosts. They were all running, and they were all being chased by shadows, dark, flickering shapes that seemed to move between the raindrops. The shapes had no defined form, just a terrifying presence that seemed to swallow the light. Elias reached the scree slope and began to slide. The rocks gave way under his feet, sending a roar of shifting stone echoing through the valley. He tumbled, skinning his elbows and knees, but he did not stop. He could feel the cold breath of something just inches from his neck. He reached the bottom of the slope and found himself in a narrow canyon he had never seen before. It was not on any map. The walls were perfectly vertical, polished, smooth by water that had not flowed in 1,000 years. The stone was a deep, obsidian black that seemed to absorb his very thoughts. He ran down the canyon, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The temperature began to drop rapidly. It went from 34 degrees to what felt like 10 below zero in a matter of seconds. His sweat began to freeze on his skin. He saw a light at the end of the canyon, a flickering, orange glow. He burst out of the narrow passage and found himself standing in his own backyard. There was his cabin, there was the wood pile he had spent all of September stacking, there was his old truck, the 1984 Ford. But something was wrong. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for 50 years. The roof had caved in, the windows were shattered. The truck was nothing but a rusted skeleton, overgrown with blackberry vines and moss. The forest had reclaimed the land, trees growing through the porch boards. Elias walked toward the porch, his boots crunching on the dead leaves. He reached the door, which was hanging by a single hinge. He stepped inside. The interior was thick with dust. In the center of the room, sitting at the kitchen table, was a skeleton. The skeleton was wearing a red flannel shirt. On the table in front of it was a stainless steel thermos and a small brass compass with a scratch on the glass in the shape of a lightning bolt. Elias backed away, his heart stopping. He looked down at his own hands. They were turning gray. The skin was wrinkling, pulling tight against the bone. His red flannel sleeve was fading, turning a dusty, pale pink. He felt his memories slipping away like water through a sieve. He realized then what Dead Man's Ridge was. It was not a place. It was a doorway. By following those tracks, by following his own future, he had stepped out of the flow of his own life. He had entered a space between seconds. He heard a floorboard creak behind him. He turned around. Standing in the doorway was a young man. The man looked to be about 25 years old. He was wearing a brand new forest ranger uniform. He had a look of wonder and excitement on his face. The young man looked right at Elias, but he did not seem to see him. He walked right through Elias, a cold chill passing through Elias's chest as the young man moved toward the table. It was as if Elias was nothing more than a draft of cold air. "Wow," the young man said, his voice echoing from a long way off. "Look at this old place. My dad told me about this cabin." The young man picked up the compass. He looked at the scratch on the glass. "This is it," the young man whispered, "the one that went missing in '94. Elias tried to scream. He tried to grab the young man's arm, but his hands passed through the boy like smoke. He was a spectator in his own tragedy. He was the ghost. He was the thing in the woods. He realized with a sickening clarity that he was the one who would eventually go back to the ridge to warn himself, perpetuating the cycle forever. The eternal loop Elias Thorne was never seen again by the people of Packwood. The search parties went out for 3 weeks. They found his truck at the trailhead. They found his rucksack on Dead Man's Ridge, sitting neatly next to a granite boulder. But they never found Elias. The official report stated that he likely fell into one of the deep crevices in the glacier or was taken by a sudden winter storm. His case was closed in 1995. But if you go to Dead Man's Ridge today, if you are a fan of the strange and the mysterious, and you happen to be there on a cold Tuesday in late October, you might see something. You might see a set of tracks in the mud. Size 11, aggressive tread, a tiny nick in the left heel, and if you are foolish enough to follow them, you might hear the sound of a man's voice. A man who is desperately trying to warn you to turn back. A man who is following his own footsteps toward a destination that has not happened yet, and yet has already ended. Because in the mountains, time does not always move in a straight line. Sometimes it circles back on itself like a predator stalking its prey. And sometimes the person you are running from is the person you are destined to become. The aftermath. The story of Elias Thorne became a local legend among the hikers and rangers of the Washington Cascades. For 30 years, people have reported seeing a gray man on the ridges around Mount Rainier. They say he does not look like a ghost. He looks solid. He looks like a man in a red flannel shirt who is just lost. He always asks the same question to anyone he encounters. What year is it? And no matter what you tell him, whether you say it is 2005 or 2026, he just shakes his head, looks down at his boots, and walks back into the mist. There was one ranger, a woman named Sarah, who worked the park in the year 2015, who had a particularly strange encounter. She was patrolling the area near Dead Man's Ridge when she found a man sitting on a log. He looked exhausted. He was clutching a stainless steel thermos. She walked up to him and asked if he was okay. The man looked up at her, and Sarah said she had never seen eyes so full of age and wisdom. They were eyes that had seen the beginning and the end of all things. "I found them," the man whispered. "Found what?" Sarah asked. "The tracks," he said. "They stop here." He pointed to the ground in front of the log. Sarah looked down, but she did not see anything but pine needles and dirt. When she looked back up, the man was gone. But lying on the log was a small silver gum wrapper. It was dry, it smelled faintly of cinnamon. Sarah picked it up and took it back to the station. She looked into the cold cases and found the file for Elias Thorne. Inside the file was a list of his personal effects that were missing. At the very bottom of the list, written in faded ink, was 1 pack of cinnamon gum. Sarah kept that wrapper in her desk for 10 years. She said that sometimes on cold nights when the wind blew down from the peaks, the wrapper would vibrate. It would hum with a low rhythmic frequency, like the sound of a heart beating, or perhaps like the sound of footsteps. Crunch, 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 always moving forward, always staying in the same place. The final mystery: what happened to Elias Thorne? Some people believe he stumbled into a thin place in the world. There are theories in quantum physics about the many worlds interpretation, the idea that every choice we make creates a new branch of reality. Perhaps Elias Thorne stepped into a place where all those branches meet, a place where the past, the present, and the future are all happening at once on a single ridge in the mountains. Or perhaps it is something much simpler. Perhaps the woods do not just contain trees and animals, perhaps they contain memories. And if a memory is strong enough, if the person who made it was connected deeply enough to the land, that memory can take on a life of its own. It can leave tracks, it can drop a compass, it can scream in the night. But whatever the truth is, the story of Elias Thorne serves as a reminder to all of us who love the wilderness. When you are out there, miles from the nearest road, surrounded by the silence of the ancient trees, pay attention to the ground. If you see a set of footprints that look exactly like yours, if you see a tread pattern that matches your own boots, right down to the smallest scratch, do not follow them. Turn around, walk back the way you came, do not look over your shoulder, because you might just find that you are following yourself into a future that you are not ready to face. And once you step into those tracks, there is no turning back. You are part of the loop. You are a part of the strange, dark, and mysterious history of the mountains. Elias Thorne is still out there. He has been out there for 32 years, and he has been out there for 5 minutes. He is walking, he is tracking, he is waiting for the moment when he finally catches up to himself. And when he does, the circle will be complete. Until then, if you find a brass compass on a ridge in the Cascades, leave it where it lies. It does not belong to you. It belongs to a man who is lost in time, a man who followed his own footsteps and found that they led exactly where he was always meant to be. The legacy of the ridge. In the years following the disappearance, Dead Man's Ridge was officially renamed by the Park Service. They called it Thorne's Point, ostensibly to honor the veteran ranger who had given so much of his life to the forest, but the locals still call it Dead Man's Ridge, and the veteran hikers avoid it. They say the air there feels heavy, like you are walking through water. They say that if you stay there too long, you start to hear voices. Not scary voices, just familiar ones. The sound of your mother calling your name. The sound of a friend you have not seen in 20 years, laughing at a joke you have not told yet. There was a group of researchers who went up there in 2022. They were armed with high-tech equipment, LiDAR scanners, thermal cameras, and sensitive audio recorders. They wanted to prove that the ghost of Elias Thorne was nothing more than atmospheric echoes and mountain hallucinations. They spent 4 nights on the ridge. On the first night, they recorded a sound that they could not explain. It was the sound of a stainless steel thermos being dropped on a rock. The acoustic analysis showed that the sound was physically impossible because there was no reverberation. It was like the sound had happened in a vacuum. On the second night, their thermal cameras picked up a heat signature. It was the shape of a man sitting by a fire. But when they ran toward the spot, there was no fire. There was no man. The ground was freezing cold. On the third night, the lead researcher, a man named Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation to Elias, or so he thought, found something in his tent. It was a small brass compass. It had a scratch on the glass in the shape of a lightning bolt. Dr. Thorne packed up the expedition the next morning. He refused to talk about what happened. He resigned from his university post and moved to a small town in the desert, as far away from the mountains as he could get. When he was asked why he left, he only had one thing to say. "I looked at the date on the back of the compass," he told a journalist in a hushed tone. "And what did it say?" the journalist asked. "It did not have a date," Dr. Thorne replied. "It had a countdown, and it was at 0. Conclusion. So, that is the story of Elias Thorne and the footprints that had not happened yet. It is a story that reminds us that our understanding of the world is only as deep as the tracks we leave behind. We think we are moving forward. We think we are making progress. But sometimes we are just walking in a very large, very mysterious circle. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to find the support buttons nearby and stay tuned for more strange, dark, and mysterious content. Until next time, stay off the ridges. Watch your step. And remember, the most dangerous thing you can find in the woods is yourself. Would you like me to find another strange and mysterious story from the Pacific Northwest for you to explore?